Hey everybody, thank you for joining me today. Just to give you a little bit of background about Zeldis, who we are, for those of you who are not familiar with us. We are a full-service boutique market research firm. Although we cover other industries, other lines of businesses, we do specialize in financial services and insurance research. We have over 20 years of experience and we have 15 full-time staff. As you'll see from what we talk about throughout this presentation, we have extensive experience in all types of methodologies, both qual and quant, and with a variety of audiences. So what are we going to talk about today? First, we're going to go through some various sample sources that we use here at Zeldis for our market research projects. Some of them will be very common sources that you've used many times before, but a couple of them may be a little bit more creative outside the box. Then we're going to walk through each of those sample sources and talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages, as well as some best times to use them and some considerations to keep in mind when working with that type of sample source. And then finally, we'll address some of the questions that were sent in to us. So first source, online panels. Obviously, it's probably something everybody's very familiar with. I've just listed a couple of the larger panels here, some of the ones that we work with often, but there's many, many more. If I listed them all, the presentation would last much, much longer. So, there's all kinds of panels and there's new ones popping up all the time. We also often work with lists sent in by our clients, customer list, member list, prospect list sometimes, lists, B2B lists of agents and brokers, all types of lists. We also work with purchased lists and database subscriptions often, Hoover's, D&B, that type of thing. We also use something called the Discovery Database, which is a list of agents and financial advisors. We work with email lists, facility lists. We also do website searches, which is exactly what it sounds like. We'll go on Google and type something in for the type of population that we're looking for. We will even go to individual company websites to source our samples sometimes. And then finally, we've used social networks where we've posted on things like Facebook or LinkedIn or joined groups on these various social networking sites to try and build our sample that way. So panel sample obviously is a very quick way to collect a lot of surveys. It can be inexpensive if you have a high incidence population or if we're working with a population that's tagged by a panel. Panels can target respondents by all sorts of criteria, demographics information, so if you're looking for a specific age group or individuals of any kind of specific data that is tagged on a panel, makes them very easy to reach. You do get very good response rates when you're working with panels because they've all opted in and they have a relationship with the panel, so you get good response rates. Although you can get B2B sample on a panel, they are stronger when it comes to consumer sample. Some of the disadvantages, probably the biggest one is the data quality. Everybody's pretty familiar with speeders and straight lining, but there's also a little bit of respondents who want to, panelists that want to participate in surveys and they like to get their rewards and all of that, kind of trying to qualify for surveys, maybe not being as honest as we'd like them to be. They've sort of understood, they've started to learn how they can, what types of answers they should give in order to get selected for a survey. So that's a concern that we have when we're working with panels. They are, although their panels are improving all the time in terms of the, demographics that they haven't always been considered to be ideal for, they are getting better in those areas and they're growing their numbers. They're still not always ideal for certain demographics. If you're looking for a narrow geography or a low incidence population, it could be very hard to find them or very expensive. As I mentioned, it's a little bit more limited when it comes to B2B, more expensive. And I think, one of the things that is even more of a concern when working with B2B is that it's hard to identify the target. Panels do tag respondents based on their title, their industry, but it's not always as accurate as we'd like it to be. We've had situations where we did a study where we had benefit managers and we did a split sample. We had a customer list for their own customers, but then we also wanted to get some prospects off of a panel. And when we compared the data in the back end, the two groups were very different. And when we looked a little bit deeper into some of their responses, we found that the data that they were giving us, it kind of made us feel that they weren't really the right people. Things like saying that 80% of them were saying that they offer cancer insurance to their employees. So that led us to start adding additional screening into our surveys when we're looking for that population. And now when we get a panel of they're tagged as benefit managers, when we use our screening criteria that requires that they have responsibility for benefits for their company, we actually lose 70% of them. So you really have to be careful when using B2B off of a panel and make sure that you're screening them properly and not just trusting that they are who they say they are. You're also going to get smaller numbers usually, and you may need to use multiple panels sometimes. If you go out to 4 or 5 panels and you have 4 of them who say they can get 100 and you have one panel who says, oh, we can get you 500, you should really be suspicious of that information. Who are those other 400 people that they're saying that they're going to get? Are they really the right people? So you really want to be a little bit more, focus on, everybody wants to get big numbers, but you want to focus on the quality over the quantity, particularly when it comes to B2B off of a panel. So some of the things that we do when we're working with panels, we get creative with our screeners. We don't want to just ask right out, if we know what people we're looking for, we don't want to come right out and ask it as a yes or no question. We'll usually embed the one response we're looking for in a list, of 5 to 10 other things so that it's not as obvious what type of person we're looking for so they don't know how to answer, and we get more accurate and honest responses. We also are always, checking our data on the back end, looking for speeders, looking for other things in our data that kind of indicate to us that maybe these aren't the right people. You can also consider putting traps in your questionnaire. Anything as simple as a timing. Sometimes you can put something in there that says how long they took to finish a certain section and compare that to everyone else, and that can kind of tag them as maybe going through it a little bit too quickly. You can put fake answers in. So if you have a list of different medications, you can put a couple of medications in there that aren't actually available to folks, and if they're using those answers, that kind of gives you an indication. We also sometimes have put in open-ended questions that we don't necessarily aren't using for our own personal purposes, but it just gives you an idea if they can't answer a question on the topic correctly, it kind of indicates that they don't really know enough about the topic. So that sometimes will help you weed out people from your data that aren't the right folks that you want. And then it's also very important to know what panel you're using. If you're working with a vendor, they should share that information with you, what panels they're going to. If you're working directly with panels, you want to ask them questions about how do they recruit panelists, what do they do to maintain their panelists, and how do they scrub their panel to make sure that they're not that if they have people that have been known to be speeders or have been cut out of other studies because of their data quality, what do they do to scrub them and upkeep their panel? So when we work with client-supplied sample, we kind of have the opposite here. So where before we were talking about one of the disadvantages of a panel is that it's hard to know that you're getting the right people. The opposite is true when you work with a client list. One of the things we love about client lists is that you know that the people that are on that list are the people that you want to talk to. It's very good for low incidence groups that you guys can identify and provide contact information for, because otherwise they'd be very difficult and very expensive to find on a panel. But if you guys actually have them and you have their contact information, it's a great way to reach those folks. It's inexpensive, obviously, because you don't have to pay for the sample source, which is a significant cost when you're doing data collection. And they're good when you want customer perspective or when you're doing branded research. So one of the disadvantages, though, is that it doesn't represent your non-customers. Depending on what your topic is, how broad the topic is that you want to talk about, you may be getting biased responses. If you're doing a brand or image study and you're comparing yourselves against your competitors, if you're using your customers as a source, you're potentially going to have a bias where your numbers are coming out more positively compared to the competition. Sometimes when we work with client lists, especially when we're looking for consumers, only phone numbers are available, which eliminates more affordable sources of data collection. Client lists are also used kind of, you got to be careful not to overuse them because you don't want to be contacting your customers too many times. So you got to be, cognizant of that as well. And then there's regulations on using customer lists for research that you have to keep in mind. So one of the things to keep in mind as well when you want to work with a list is to check all possible sources inside your company. We've had situations where we have worked with different people inside the same organization, and we've been able to get a list from one of our contacts, but the other contact says that they don't have a list. So sometimes people don't know about all the sources that they have. So kind of check into every possibility inside your organization if you're looking for a list first before realizing or coming to the conclusion that you don't have access to a list. If you are doing a customer list and you're doing a broader research topic, think about adding a prospect or a non-customer cell that you would source from some other resource. If you can, offer an incentive or a drawing that helps with response rate. And then you have to obviously ensure that any kind of spam and ethical considerations are addressed when you're using your lists. So purchased lists or database subscriptions, they can give you a large number of your target certain types of lists. Depending on who the list source is, it can actually be more cost effective than using panels. You can use the list multiple times throughout the year. The same list can be used, and you'd be surprised to see what kind of lists are out there. I think some people don't realize that there's lists out there for different kinds of populations. There's obviously a variety in the quality of that list, but if you're looking for a specific group, look into it. Go on the internet, Google search any kind of list first, and see what you can find out there, because you might be surprised that there actually is something out there that you might not have even realized it exists. Some of the disadvantages, really it's kind of a numbers game when you're working with these lists. So I mentioned that there could be a large number on the list, but one of the things that we frequently see with these types of lists is that they're very low incidence and the response rates are very low. So you could have a huge number, but you're going to get low response rate, and then a lot of the people on the list might not be the right people. They might not be exactly the people that you're looking for. But if the numbers are large enough and you create effective screening questions, you still often will get what you need out of them. You do need to purchase them annually, so a lot of these lists are an annual subscription, which obviously that's a drawback, but the reason is because they're updating their lists all the time, which is obviously what you want. You wouldn't want to use a list that was 5 or 10 years old anyway. When it comes to these purchased lists, another thing to point out is that some of them can be purchased by anyone. Some of them are limited in who they allow to purchase them. The prices vary too considerably depending on what the source is, and obviously the less expensive they are, the kind of lower quality, the more people you're going to have to screen out and the lower the response rate is going to be. But there is a wide variety. Discovery database, which I mentioned before, which has agents and financial advisors, that's an example of one of the more expensive lists, and it is exclusively can be purchased by individual companies. Market research companies cannot buy it. So that's an example of sort of where they have limitations on who could buy them. You could also consider partnering with an association. They may be willing to share their list with you. If you explain to them that it's for research purposes only, and if you can provide some incentive to them, such as sharing the results with them, or some other way in which the research that you're doing is going to benefit their members. When it comes to using these lists, we actually offer incentives. Even with quantitative research, we'll offer an incentive, and usually that's something as simple as having an Amazon gift code pop up on their screen when they complete the survey. The other thing to keep in mind when you're using these kinds of databases and lists is that because the list is going to be low incidence, if you're going to reuse it throughout the year, do some maintenance on it. So if you have a bunch of people that screen out because they aren't right for any of the research that you'll be doing throughout the year, delete them from the list before you use it again. If you have some people who screen out because they aren't right for that particular study, but they may be right for a future study, add fields to the information. That kind of helps you target the list better in the future. So you can kind of not only reuse the list, but you can kind of improve it over time so that it works a little bit better for you, and maybe you'll be higher incidence for the next project. Facility databases are a great resource when we are looking for very specific groups, narrow, hard to find groups, but they have to be kind of clearly defined. Facility databases have a lot of different kinds of folks on there, so as long as you can be really specific, you can often find people on these databases. You get good response rates. Again, similar to panels, people on facility databases have a relationship with the facility, so they tend to be more likely to respond and agree to participate in the research. Most of what we do at Zeldis is domestic, so I am pulling on experience that is more domestic than international, but I don't see any reason why these wouldn't apply to international respondents as well. So some of the disadvantages of working with a facility database, you're working with more smaller numbers, more qualitative options here. In some cases, you may not be able to get all geographies, or if you can get certain geographies, maybe you might not have sufficient counts in that particular geography. Not every population, although databases have a wide variety of populations, not every population can be found on a database, and they obviously, can be expensive way to source your research. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize about facility databases, I think they think of them when they're doing in-person research. We often will use facility databases to reach these harder to find folks when we're doing other types of qualitative methodology. So online focus groups, bulletin boards, telephone depth interviews. If you can't travel, or you don't want to travel, or you're looking for a more nationally representative population, you can still use facility databases, especially if you're working with a facility that has a national presence. So that's an option for you more often than I think people think of it. So website searches, something that we've used when our more traditional sources have not really been as successful for us. We use them for very low incidence targets. Some examples of when we use them: we had a study where we had a client who wanted to speak to TPAs, and they didn't have a current list of people that they worked with. They just wanted to go out to prospects, and they don't exist on panels. They're hard to find that way. So they gave us a list of the target companies that they wanted to speak to, but they didn't have any contact information. So we just went and input all those went out to all those company websites, searched for phone numbers, searched for names to compile a list. And I think we ended up looking up somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 or 400 different companies to come up with these numbers. Another time that we've used it, another way that we've used it, is when we were looking for, we knew we were doing in-person qualitative research, and we knew the locations where we wanted to go. So we had a list of zip codes, and we went online. We were looking to talk to mechanics. So we just input those zip codes and did went to Yellow Pages to look for mechanics in those zip codes and compiled our sample that way. We were looking for brokers who sell individual disability insurance. So we went to all different broker websites to get names, and then we screened them to find out what they sold. So, it gets you targeting very specific companies or specific types of individuals. It gives you an option when, other sources maybe haven't given you one, and you might otherwise not be able to do the research if you didn't have a way to find them. The disadvantages, pretty big, obvious one. It's not a random or representative sample. You can't project it to the population. It is extremely time-consuming. So if you're going to have to build sample this way, That's something that you have to build in. I'd say about a week it takes to, couple hours a day, every day, going in, doing the digging. Usually we have somebody who's sort of focused on just doing that, and it takes, a good 4 or 5 hours a day of their time. You do get lower response rates in the example where I mentioned before with the TPAs. So the numbers that we were getting were, 800 numbers on these large company websites. So obviously when we called them, it's not the same as having a direct line with a contact name. So we do get lower response rates when we build the sample this way. And then you are talking about smaller numbers. So you're really talking about a qualitative solution only with this type of sample solution. The other thing to keep in mind with this or with any other low incidence population where you're talking about small numbers or they're already difficult to reach, you want to keep your other criteria as broad as possible. You don't want to put too many other layers of screening criteria on there because you're already talking about a very narrow target of people. If you then refine that further, you're really going to get very, very small numbers. So social networking sources, what we've done here, we've posted to Facebook, we've posted to LinkedIn with a specific type of person that we're looking for. So one example is when we've done a segmentation study and we've had 3 or 4 specific segments identified. And then we want to follow up when we want to do qualitative research with those types of individuals to sort of understand a little bit more about how they think and how they work. So we've gone and we posted to Facebook saying, do you know anybody who fits this criteria? Do you or do you know anybody who fits this criteria? We've done it with other very low incidence targets. So for example, when we were looking for women of newborns, and they had to be a specific age group, very difficult to find any other way in small numbers, but we were looking for them to participate in a formula study, and we used social networking for that as well. We've looked up people with very rare medical conditions and found them that way as well. So we either post to a social networking site or sometimes we'll post in groups. When you post in groups, you need to get permission for that. So some of the advantages of using this are similar to what we talked about with the website searches. It gives you an option where you might not otherwise have one. All of the groups that we've used this for would have been very difficult or next to impossible to find, extremely expensive for the ones that we found, and you wouldn't really be getting large numbers anyway. So it's been it gives you an option where you might not otherwise have one. It's convenient, it's inexpensive, obviously. Depending on who you're looking for and how you're trying to find them, you could get a quick response for them. Similar disadvantages as well, though. It's a convenient sample. It's not random or representative in any way. You can't project it. You're talking about small numbers again. You're talking about a qualitative strategy only in this scenario. Although I did mention that it could be a quick way to find folks, depending on who the people are or how hard they are to find, it could actually take you a long time as well. So it really sort of depends whether you're going to get a quick response or it's going to take longer. It also could be difficult to get permission. If you want to post in a group, you may have to wait to get permission. So you may request to post, and it may take a week or more for them to get back to you and say, sure, you have permission to post. Or depending on who the population is or how hard they are to find, it could take you a while to find them, just even if you get permission right away. It is better for consumer targets. As I mentioned, it's really a qualitative solution. You're not going to get any kind of quantitative numbers with this type of sample source. And I'd say it's better for exploratory type research, although we have used it for qualitative type of concept test. So the next couple of slides that we're going to go through are some of the questions that were sent in to us about populations of interest that people wanted to know where they could be found. So the first is small business tradespeople. So truckers, landscapers, construction workers, mechanics, electricians, anybody who is has a type of job that has them out on the road busy and they're harder to reach. They're not sitting in front of a computer, or they're not by their phone. So we do surveys with these folks all the time. They do tend to be more qualitative methodologies. We've used facility databases for them. We get very good show rates even with in-person research with these groups. But we can get, for some of the groups, depending on what type of industry you're looking for and how narrow or broad your other criteria are, we can get some smaller quant numbers, probably in the neighborhood of 20 to 30, although for some groups you might be able to get as many as 50, 60, somewhere in that neighborhood. But again, it's going to depend on what the other criteria are, how many you can get. But we have done that. We have reached some of those folks on panels. I think alternative methodologies are also good for these people. Rather than recruiting them to a central facility and requiring them to come to you, we've actually gone out to their sites. So we recruit them, and we try to obviously kind of group people somewhat close to each other, but we'll go out and we'll just drive to each of their sites and meet them at their place of business, so that we're kind of working with their schedule. If they have somebody who comes in that they have to, customer comes in and they have to talk to that person, they can kind of stop the interview and do that. So work with their schedule. I also think mobile technologies are going to become more popular with these folks. I think a lot of them, just by the nature of their business, have to have a smartphone with them at all times. If they have to call somebody to tell them they're late, if they get a call from somebody else. So I think that's going to be an emerging type of methodology with these folks. We've also used, as I mentioned, facility databases, Hoovers, D&B, Yellow Page, internet search to reach them as well. So we also had a question about using LinkedIn or social media for data mining. So this is a bit different from what I talked about before about how we've created sample on social networking. This is more about understanding what's currently being said out there on the internet about your brand or about a topic that might be relevant or interesting to your industry. And what we've seen done, I will say that this is something that we do more primary research. That's more our focus. So we don't have as much experience doing kind of data mining, but we have done it. One of the things that we've done is joining relevant communities or groups to sort of see what's being said by those targets. We also, I pulled some information here about some different sources that you can use. There's actually, there's two different kinds of social media mining. One is free, and then there's also paid licensing services. So obviously free, that's great because it's free, but one of the things to keep in mind is that you get what you pay for, and you're going to be a bit more limited in the types of search criteria that you can put in, the type of output that you get, versus a paid licensing service, which is obviously a significant expense. Usually it's you get a single license, you get paid by the license, so for every person that you want to have access to it, the fee changes a little bit, and it's an annual fee. So I do have some names up here. I just want to say we're not endorsing any in particular, but they're some of the ones that we're aware of, and I will say we've had some experience with the paid service that's on the bottom there, the net-based. So one of the things about the paid services that are good is that it gives you a lot of flexibility. So you can say, okay, I want to hear everything that's being said about my brand in this particular geography from these dates. Let's say you did an ad in a specific media location, and the ad played on this particular week. So if you want to find out what people were saying before and after, you can actually refine your search that way. The other thing that's really good is it looks at multiple sources. So it looks at everything that's being said. You put in your keywords, whatever they might be, and your search criteria, whether it's a time frame or a geography, and you can hear everything that's being said anytime that keyword comes up in social media. It looks at all the different social media sites, but it also looks at forums, blogs, anytime, when articles are posted and people make comments below the article, it looks at all of that kind of information. So it really mines a lot of internet sources, and it will pull back, basically it gives you a hit list. So it tells you how many times that particular keyword shows up and then it'll cut that information by all the different, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. And then it'll also say how many times it comes up in forums, blogs, or any other locations. So it really gives you a lot of flexibility. As I mentioned, the kind of drawback is the fact that you do have to pay by the user, and it's an annual fee. One of the other questions that we received were about reaching out to insurance buyers, basically figuring out who is the individual with the most influence in the purchase decision. So most often when we're looking for these folks, we do get client lists for them. Facility databases, Hoovers, D&B, those are also options as well. If we're talking about small markets, you can find these folks on panels, but when it comes to the mid and large size markets, we depend more on lists or facility databases, and we do more of a qualitative methodology with those folks. What we do is we screen for the level of influence on the purchase decision, or we'll ask the agent, what are the titles, who are the people that are the ones that they're working with. And one of the other questions we received was whether or not it's the same person buying specialty lines, and really in our experience it varies by company whether or not it's the same individual. So we also had questions about reaching specific targets, specific customer targets, both current customers and prospects as well. And these are the areas that they were looking at: office manager, HR manager, safety manager, and risk manager. For office managers and HR managers, we've used client lists and facility databases for these groups often. But you can also get a good number of them from panels, particularly if your other criteria are not very narrow. If you have broad screening criteria, you can get a few hundred of office manager or HR managers from a panel. When it comes to safety managers or risk managers, there we rely more heavily on qualitative research. Facility databases have been a good resource, or Hoovers, client lists if you have them as well. And then finally, we were asked about how to reach industry experts, thought leaders. These typically, what we do is we identify them on a case-by-case basis with the client. So we talk about how you would define a thought leader. For a particular study, for that research, who do you consider to be the thought leader? Then we look to see who's been published. We look for anyone who's given talks or presentations at conferences on the topic, or is mentioned frequently in interviews with others. A lot of this is about how you position the interview with the potential respondent. If you explain to them that they're being asked to participate in this research because we consider them to be a thought leader or an expert in the industry, that goes a long way in getting their buy-in. Makes them feel important, and people like to feel that way, so it makes them feel good about participating in the research. Also, don't underestimate the importance of a good recruiter, and that's true for any time you're doing qualitative research. We have somebody that we work with that's fantastic. She's really great at getting through gatekeepers and understanding how to get to these folks, these hard to reach folks. It's especially important when you're talking about somebody like thought leaders that are really hard to reach. But anytime you're doing qual, having somebody who can kind of build that rapport and be able to get through the gatekeepers is really important. So that's all that I have. Are there any questions? We have a couple of list sources that we know of and that we use more frequently. We have, or we've had clients, because a lot of times the clients are the ones who have to be the purchasers of these lists. As I mentioned, some lists we can buy, but a lot of times we can't buy them. They won't let research companies buy them. But we have gone in. I think we found brokers that way. I'm not sure who else we found that way, but I know we have used them. It's very surprising. You could just, if you were looking for insurance agents, just go to insurance, go to Google and type in insurance agent lists, and you'll be shocked what you'll come up with. Doing, an important caveat is that when you do that, you may get stuff that's not great, but depending on how expensive they are and what other resources you have. If you're sort of out of options, it's not a bad idea to try it. But something like Discovery, while it's more expensive, it's better known, and you're going to get better quality. I would say going to Google and just typing in broker list. You're gonna you got to be a little wary of what you're getting, and you have to sort of expect that the quality of what you're getting and all of that. You have to be prepared for anything. So we have used it, but we do tend to try and rely more often on something a little bit more known.